Welcome to Half an Hour with Dr. Eric Langenbacher. My name is Victor Harbecke. I'm the chair of the Association of German American Centers, and it's my pleasure to host this very first edition of our new digital event series, Half an Hour with. If you've not heard of the Association of German American Centers before, please take a look in the chat. You can find more information about us there. We are a network of 12 transatlantic nonprofit organizations that build bridges between Germany and the US, especially on a people-to-people level. Our 12 members all have a distinct identity and strong regional presence, but we also offer joint programs like this one. And today we are delighted to spend half an hour with Dr. Eric Langenbacher, who is a teaching professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University, and who also serves as director of the Society, Culture, and Politics program at the American German Institute, AGI, in Washington, D.C. You can find his full bio in the chat. A very warm welcome to you, Eric.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The first year of the second Trump presidency is now behind us, and it's been a wild ride, to say the least. Eric, I know you've brought us some thoughts to kickstart the conversation, so I'll hand over to you before we go to questions.
All right. Thank you so much. I think it's not an understatement to say that this is probably the most unsettling and troubling point in the German-American relationship, probably since World War II. A lot of people have talked about the evolution of the transatlantic relationship. A lot of people have talked about the return of geopolitical competition. But I think I would probably have to go with the Canadian Prime Minister and his Davos speech, where he talked about how we're at a point of rupture right now. But what's interesting, I think that in Germany, at least, I think politicians and leaders have been a little bit more careful with the rhetoric that they use. But, let's go back to election night, Bundestag election night, February 23rd of last year, so just about a year ago, and what the eventual Chancellor Friedrich Merz said that night. And let's not forget that Merz is one of the staunchest Atlanticists that one could imagine. I mean, he actually was running the flagship Atlantikbrücke for a decade. And this is what he said. He said, "My absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that step by step we can really achieve independence from the United States." I never thought I would have to say something like this on a television program, but after Donald Trump's statements last week at the latest, and that was just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to statements, right? It is clear that the Americans, at least this part of the Americans, this administration, are largely indifferent to the fate of Europe. But what's interesting is, I mean, if we want to take a deeper dive for a second, this isn't a new statement from a German leader. Angela Merkel, back in 2017, already said the era in which we could fully rely on others is over to some extent. And then she, of course, added, "We Europeans truly have to take our fate into our own hands, naturally in friendship with the United States of America, in friendship with Great Britain, as good neighbors with whoever, also with Russia and other countries." I think Russia took itself off that list no later than the full invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But the fact that the United States of America might be taken off that list is truly revolutionary. I do think that Europeans are starting to get the message from the Trump administration. There was the memorable speech by Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference last year, also just about a year ago, where he really talked about some of the biggest threats to the Atlantic Alliance and to Europe are coming from within, he said, speaking specifically to censorship or whatnot of the alternative for Germany and everything like that. We also saw it in the national security strategy that was published in December, where they talked about the gravest threat to the transatlantic relationship and Europe is civilizational erasure because of migration, multiculturalism, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the other thing that I've been thinking about for a long time, too, is that Trump in particular and the people around him seem to have an especial animus towards Germany. So in the national security strategy, in the Europe section, there are only 3 countries that were mentioned by name. There was Britain and Ireland, but it was a very dismissive kind of reference to them that, naturally Americans feel nostalgia for the Brits and the Irish, right? So kind of like, there has-beens, but, we think fondly, nostalgically about them. And then he took on Germany for untrade trade practices and things like that. So I really think there is a specific danger for Germany and the United States, and not to the same degree as other kind of European countries, which Trump seems to let off the hook and everything like that. Now, that being said, as much as we might be in this period of unprecedented disruption, the basis of the transatlantic relationship is pretty strong. And it's difficult to think that that's going to change too radically. Although with this administration, something that seemed impossible 3 days ago now all of a sudden becomes policy. I don't think anybody would have predicted a year ago even that he would try to go after Greenland as aggressively as he has. Now, it seems that he's kind of pulled back from that for the time being, but we'll see. So you can never say never. That being said, there are about 36 to 38,000 US troops that are stationed in Germany right now in 119 bases. And this is part of the 67,000 troops that are in Europe. There have periodically been worries that Trump's going to withdraw a bunch of troops from Europe, which would then, of course, make European countries vulnerable to threats, perhaps from Russia or from other places. But the other thing is that the US Congress has tried to intervene a little bit. I mean, they've been kind of absent over the last year, but back in December in the National Defense Authorization Act, the Senate insisted the troop levels in Europe could not be below 76,000 for more than 45 days. I mean, it's very technical, but I think that means that we don't have to fear a kind of mass withdrawal of US troops, and then with the consequences that would come from that. Of course, economically, ties are very deep and comprehensive. So for the US back in 2024, we don't have 2025 figures yet. Germany was 4th for imports and 7th for exports. And for Germany, the US was the top export destination. In fact, nearly 11% of all German exports went to the United States. And it was also the US was the 3rd highest source of imports. There has been a massive trade surplus between Germany and the United States for many years, which amounted to about $250 billion in 2024. So those ties aren't going to go away. According to some estimates, about 1 million jobs in the United States are dependent on German investments. BMW, for instance, has its largest production facility in the world in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Volkswagen is here. So many German companies have created these kind of investments. And so that's the important kind of substrate to the economic relationship. That being said, we know that Trump loves tariffs. What does he call himself? Tariff man or something like that. And although there probably has been no more drama in any other field than in the field of tariffs and economic policy, they go up, they go down, who knows? Currently, the United States has the highest tariff level since the 1930s at about 17%. Vis-a-vis Europe, the basic tariff rate is 15%, but there's a 50% tariff on steel, aluminum, and copper, and 25% on automobiles and auto parts. So that has already had a bit of an impact. I just saw trade figures the other day, which showed that the trade deficit has gone down pretty markedly thanks to the tariffs and other things. We should also not forget that the US dollar is weaker, so that's going to have an impact as well. So we'll see how much economic disruption there is as well from all of this. Now, the final thing that I'd like to say about the transatlantic relationship and the German-American relationship currently is, oftentimes people ask me about the state of it, and my response is always, well, which one? Because there's the conventional, the traditional, the establishment, transatlantic relationship with ministers, with the deep cultural ties between the two countries. But now there's an alternative transatlantic relationship that the alternative for Germany is building with the Trump administration and with parts of the MAGA movement. We saw a real increase in the number of visits, especially after Trump's victory. There were a couple of main leaders like Krupala who were at the inauguration and everything like that. One of the concerns about this is that oftentimes people don't know about these visits. So, for instance, Marcus Frohnmayer was in Washington, D.C., and he actually came to my university and talked to the college Republicans. And I only found out about that because some kid in my class's roommate went to it the night before. So it's a little concerning that this alternative relationship is happening kind of in the shadows without people knowing, which means that we don't know what's being discussed, what positions are being taken, and everything like that. But that's something perhaps we can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A. So I've probably talked long enough and longer than I planned to. So Victoria, please, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Eric, for that input. I have a bunch of questions I want to ask, but I also want to encourage our guests to pose their questions, and you can do so through the Q&A tool here on Zoom. And we may not be able to get to every single question, given that we have over 200 guests in the audience, but I will incorporate as many of them as I can. Eric, I want to pick up on one thing you said, that special animus that members of the Trump administration, especially J.D. Vance, seem to be having towards Germany. Any idea where that's coming from?
Oh, well, one can only truly speculate. I mean, one can take their words at face value, but of course, there's been a lot of speculation about if there's something more deeply psychological going on. Trump, of course, has German American roots, but for a long time he said that he was Swedish or something like that. So I don't want to get into, armchair psychoanalysis, but who knows? It could be something like that. But I also think that there's a fundamental lack of understanding and a lack of a will to understand basic kind of cultural differences. So let's take free speech, for instance. I mean, Americans take their First Amendment rights very seriously. And there's been until relatively recently, there's been a very liberal understanding of what freedom of speech means. So basically, you can say almost anything. I think that in Germany, at least in the Federal Republic of Germany, since 1949 and the Basic Law, I think there's been a different understanding of free speech, or at least that there is a trade-off between free speech and defamation, or free speech and hate speech, free speech and incitement, and things like that. And so sometimes some of these restrictions that Germans, I know that not every German is going to agree with that, right? But some of these restrictions, right? Like, some teacher getting fined for, or an AfD politician getting fined for saying something that was Nazi rhetoric, right? That's something that I think many Americans, and especially many MAGA Americans, just don't understand. Another thing too is the kind of constitutional surveillance, and then the ability to ban a political party through the Verfassungsschutz in Germany is also something that I think they fundamentally don't understand. And again, many Germans have an issue with these kind of illiberal measures as well. But I think those are some of the things that have kind of irked Trump and people in his orbit. The other thing too that I should add, going back to the economy, is Trump hates trade deficits, right? He thinks that people are exploiting them, right, if they have a trade surplus. And given that Germany is the quintessential trading state and has had a rather large trade surplus with the United States for a long time, I think is another reason for the animus.
Yeah. So how should Europe and Germany in particular respond to, let's say, the unraveling of the American-led rules-based order that we have benefited from so enormously?
Well, I mean, I think that the response is already happening. This is I was just reading a paper the other day about the German auto industry, and I mean, this is orthogonal to the point, but the discourse has been that the German auto industry is in its death throes, that it's not what it once was, and it's never going to be that again. And this person was arguing that, well, when Germans have these Standortdebatten, is exactly a sign that they're actually doing stuff to resolve the problem. So he was actually very sanguine about the future of the automobile sector. And I think you can say the same thing when it comes to the transatlantic relationship, that I think that more has already been done to respond to some of this. So for instance, the increase in defense spending, right? The plan is 5%, 3.5% on conventional defense, and 1.5% on defense-related infrastructure projects, which can be pretty capaciously understood, I would think. So I think that is one response that has already happened. But in terms of like a larger, almost kind of strategic response, I'm not sure, to be honest, because there's evidence that different strategies can pay off. I mean, one is just to go under the radar screen, right, and hope that you're not going to be kind of like targeted for this or that. I got a call from a Korean journalist the other day asking why, because he just announced a big increase in tariffs on Korea. He's like, why now? Right? I'm like, I don't know. For some reason, you were under the radar screen and now you're not. So you could just try to stay under the radar screen. Some people think that the best thing to do is just to comply with what they're doing, which is what some universities and law firms have done domestically in the United States and many countries for that matter, right? And then others are like, this is a person who only understands and respects strength. So the best response is a strong response. So if he's going to levy, 30% tariffs on your economy, do the same thing to them right back. So and luckily I can just talk. I don't have to make policy, and I don't envy those that have to come up with a policy under these circumstances.
Mm. Do you think strategic autonomy is a real option for Europe?
Eventually. The issue is that, according to estimates that I've seen, it will take at least 5 years to maybe get to the possibility of that. It could likely take a little longer. And it's going to be very complicated. I've been thinking a lot about nuclear weapons and whatnot. And Germany, of course, doesn't possess and has renounced the possession or the development of nuclear weapons. But the fact that there is the nuclear guarantee from the United States has obviated the need for that. So when it comes to tricky things like that, it'll be kind of very difficult. The other issue too, I actually had one of my researchers work on this, right? That part of this is in the 2+4 agreement that led to German reunification back in 1990. And, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is something that could be gotten around if Germany thought it was necessary to have that kind of capability. But the 2+4 agreement would be more complicated. And it's likely that Russia and the United States would have veto power over something like that. So it would be easier said than done. But I don't know. My feeling is that that's where Europe's headed.
Right. One question I've been getting a lot in talking to a broad cross-section of the public here is how much of this is going to last? How much of Trump's foreign policy approach is here to stay? And which elements could be reversed by a next administration?
I mean, there's a lot that could change with a next administration. But I mean, one of the points I was trying to get at earlier when I was referencing Merz and then Merkel, I mean, the Merkel speech was from 2017, right? So that's 9 years ago at this point. There have been trends going on for a while, right? I mean, Obama issued a lot of pressure on the Germans and Europeans to spend more on defense. Biden, if you remember the Inflation Reduction Act and the response in Europe to this kind of form of protectionism. So, from one perspective, there are these trends that have been developing for a while. Sometimes we look back at Obama and even the Biden administrations with rose-colored glasses, but things weren't, the way they were, in 1995 or in 2005, for that matter, right? So I don't think we're going to be able to go back despite kind of entirely, despite efforts to kind of do so. The other thing too, which is even more kind of dire, is that, the more that I think about life and the more that I think about foreign affairs or domestic affairs for that matter. It's all about relationships. It's all about trust. And I think that what Trump has done is fundamentally break the trust that was necessary for a vigorous transatlantic relationship to exist. So, I mean, of course, anything can be repaired, but it's going to take a real long time, not just a 4-year presidency, to get back to a semblance of what we had before. And there could be a lot of damage done. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine is still unresolved. There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how long Ukraine can hold out, especially with these horrible Russian attacks on the energy infrastructure in the middle of winter. It's unclear how much, or if anything, the US will continue to give to Ukraine to help in their defense if the Europeans can kind of step in. So I don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty, but I really, my gut tells me we're not going back to where things were.
Mhm. I want to circle back to that new pillar in the transatlantic partnership that may be in the making right now, namely between MAGA Republicans and the Alternative for Germany. And there seems to be some interest in that from the audience as well. Um, do you observe real sort of policy convergence between these groups on issues like migration, climate, Russia, Ukraine, or is this primarily Symbolpolitik? Is this primarily symbolic?
Well, there's been so much excellent research done that I could, maybe mention if people are interested in this. There's a great report by Jacob Ross that DGAP just published on many of these things. And so I think that right now the consensus seems to be that it's not just symbolism, that there really is policy exchange. And if you look at some of the platforms that the AFD has come up with, it's very similar to what you might find in Trump's Republican Party's platforms and stuff like that. The animus towards migration, the kind of the emphasis on, I mean, I guess it's a mainstream term now. It wasn't even 2 years ago, but this whole notion of remigration, the animus towards clean forms of energy, and the emphasis on fossil fuels. All of this is really kind of shared across the Atlantic right now. But but what's interesting is, so especially after the Greenland episode, I mean, even AFD politicians and leaders were kind of critical of Trump and MAGA world's stance on the whole thing. And I think, I mean, they're also responsive to public opinion. I read somewhere that only 18% of Germans, approve of the performance or the policy of the second Trump administration. And I think it was 30% of AFD people, right? So it always, I don't know, it all, this kind of like pro-MAGA, pro-American stance was always a little curious to me in the AFD, because kind of like a form of anti-Americanism seemed to be part of the appeal, especially in the region of the core support of the AFD in Eastern Germany. And that was the concomitant to the kind of like pro-Russian, pro-Putin stance, which still seems to be pretty widespread in that party.
Yeah, absolutely. How is the AFD perceived in the US?
Well, I mean, it will depend on who you ask. If you ask, Trump supporters, they probably think the AFD is A-OK, precisely because the rhetoric is so similar. And, one of the dynamics on the American right for a while has been the sense of victimization, right? That they've been victimized by elites, by globalization, by liberal institutions, the liberal establishment. And the AFD has that kind of victim narrative as well. But especially with the, constitutional surveillance of the party, I mean, I think that kind of resonates a little bit. So I think that, the American right and conservatives think the AFD is, a kindred spirit. But I can tell you that in establishment venues, in more democratic and liberal leaning quadrants of the American public, there's a deep unease about the AFD. People are also very aware of German history and the partial resonances with the period between 1933 and 1945. And that's something that comes to mind amongst Americans of that ilk. But, the one thing to always understand about the United States today is that this is a deeply polarized environment. And, in fact, empirical research shows that the United States is more polarized today than any other country or region, at least in the West, has been for over a 70-year period. So it's always about who you ask, and you'll get very different responses.
I know you followed developments in Germany as well, since you just mentioned polarization and we were talking about the AfD. Is the US just a couple of decades ahead of Germany in terms of polarization?
I don't know. That's an excellent question, because Germany is more polarized than it was before, but nowhere near as polarized as the United States. It's funny. So Beatrix von Stohr published a position paper last summer, I think it was in August, in the AfD's Bundestag-Fraktion about their strategy to overcome the firewall and to be able to be koalitionsfähig, as the Germans would say, right? And what was interesting in that document was that they estimate that the ceiling of their support is 30%. Right? That's what they think. So, you're not going to have the same degree of polarization as in the United States, because they're not going to get to 50%, right? Whereas, especially in a two-party system like ours, you're going to get to 50%, which of course then exacerbates the polarization dynamics. So I think that Germany's multi-party status is going to limit the amount of polarization. I also think that the information environment, although it has changed in Germany, has not changed to the same degree as in the United States. And one big reason for that is you have robust, nonpartisan, although some people would disagree with that as well, right? Nonpartisan state media, right? Through, ARD, through Deutsche Welle, through Deutschlandfunk and stuff like that. So I think that your media environment has not become as polarized or as pillarized as in the United States, and that will also limit the degree of polarization.
Interesting. We were not going to get through this half an hour without talking about Greenland. We have a few questions on that in the chat, and I want to weave it together with something I've been thinking about, namely, are we seeing some cracks in Trump's coalition? We saw congressional resistance to the idea of sort of taking over Greenland. And there's also doubts whether MAGA is really behind this type of foreign intervention. We also had Joe Rogan's comments on Renee Good's killing in Minnesota. So how are we seeing cracks, or how solid is support for Trump?
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times in the first term and now in the second term I've read articles about these cracks forming, but then they don't. So I mean, I'll believe it when I see it, to be completely honest. I mean, there are definitely different factions under kind of Trump's coalition, and the commonality is that they're all held together by Trump. So I don't think you're going to see any meaningful cracks that will emerge until after Trump leaves the political stage in January of 2029. Then it's an open question whether they'll ever be able to get that kind of unity again, because there is a bit of a cult of personality that's been going on for a good decade or longer at this point. And that'll be very difficult to replicate. Trump also has a certain appeal, many people would call it charisma, that very few leading figures in his coalition have. Marco Rubio certainly doesn't have it. I don't think J.D. Vance has that same degree of, impact as Trump does. So I think that he'll keep it together. He'll keep the coalition together while he's still in power. And then after that, it'll be a free-for-all, in my opinion.
Right. I'm hearing the church bells, which is in Cologne always a sign that another 15 minutes has passed. It's 5:45. We're almost out of time, Eric. I really appreciate your time. We have a primarily German audience, would be my guess. What do you want to leave with people who are interested in the US, who are following the news, who are feeling that rupture? What should we take away from this conversation?
Well, I mean, what I would say to you is that the United States still needs Germany and Germans. We, especially now, needed to still want to understand us, to still travel here, to see with your own eyes, to speak to like-minded people who care about the transatlantic relationship, especially in its kind of traditional guise. So I really hope that you continue to think fondly of the United States, will continue to engage with us.
All right. Thank you so much. I apologize to everyone whose questions we were not able to answer. You will just have to join us for the next edition of our Half an Hour with series, which will take place on March 10th, about a month from now, 5 p.m. German time, and it will feature Peter Rowe of the Hudson Institute. For now, I want to thank you very much, Eric Langenbacher. It was a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.